Today we have a panelist with us. We're going to be talking about microaggression and what our words have impact. And I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. Who would like to go first?
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Kenneth Reed. I serve as the Director of African American and Multicultural Affairs here at Minnesota State University Mankato, as well as the Chair of the President's Commission on Diversity.
Okay. Hi, my name is Dani Scott, and I am a new assistant, not very new anymore, first year assistant professor here at MSU in Communication Sciences and Disorders, and I'm leading the efforts in diversity, equity, and inclusion in our department, so I'm so glad to be here.
My name is Kevin. I'm a first-year assistant professor in the English department, working in tactical communication, but my research area is in anti-racist practices. That was what my dissertation was about.
Okay. So I guess I'll go ahead and start this conversation for us then. Thank you so much for the introduction, Samuel and Liz, thank you for having us. And today we're having a conversation about microaggressions. Words have impact, especially when it comes to our students. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with some counterparts and peers around our institution who are working with our students more directly in our academic affairs, and then me working on the more student affairs side of the house. I think for us to have the conversation, we need to start off with what is a microaggression? So let me give you a definition, and then we can talk about it as a group as far as what does it look like for us as people of color? So microaggressions are brief or commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether they're intentional or not. So you might not have the intention of doing it, but it still happens, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights or insults perpetuated against a particular person. Now, for me, and Dani and excuse me, Dr. Scott and Dr. Dover, excuse me, Dr. Scott and Dr. Dover, I mean, what does that look like for you as far as some examples of microaggressions? Because I just want to make sure our audience understands what that looks like first before we dive into the conversation.
You go first. You go.
Oh, well, I just wanted to also explain that there's different types of microaggressions. So they can look different, and we kind of put them in little categories, if you will. But overall, the micro part really describes the subtle nature of the offense, but the aggression shows that it is indeed an offense and a type of symbolic violence. So like micro assaults are really just the old-fashioned racism, and I think it's more overt, and that's what people are maybe more familiar with. It's easier to point out micro assaults, but then you have micro invalidations, which is really invalidating the experience of people of color, and also micro insults are kind of like snubs or under the table, well, sometimes not under the table, in front of the table, snubs that you make towards people of color. And so they can take a variety of forms, but I think overall, just because they are subtle does not mean that they are not impactful. And so they can be incredibly impactful.
I appreciate that.
And I would just like to add, I can add a practical example, and then for me, an important part of microaggressions is that often it isn't always seen because the person of color, so in this instance, it's like I'm a Black person, is like we are transforming our behaviors essentially all of the time in all of our interactions to try to mitigate the impact of those like microaggressions. And so the manner that I speak is completely contrived in the kind of arenas that I happen to operate in, because I'm trying to always constrain myself from those microaggressions. And I can give you an example of when I was in my dissertation, my first committee told me that I wasn't a good fit, quote unquote, that I was too hostile, that I was too aggressive, that I was too defensive, that I said, I confronted them. They were all white on their use of critical race theory, which was incorrect. And that began the process of them telling me that they didn't think that I would work out in that particular program And for me, because obviously I got my degree, I had to do an end around those people who were trying to essentially short shrift me in that particular process because they didn't think that I fit what they expected of me, and I had to get a completely different committee. So those microaggressions can become macroaggressions very, very quickly if you aren't on top of your game.
Thank you. I see that Dr. Berry's joined us. Dr. Berry, first of all, we did a quick introduction of who we were, and then we're just getting into the conversation of what microaggressions looks like for us in a practical sense.
Would you like me to speak into the space? Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I'm coming from, and I had trouble with my technology, so I apologize. So first, I guess my name is Timothy Berry. I'm seeing some names that I do know, but I just want to make sure I introduce myself. So my reason for being here, I always start with my why rather than what I do, but it's because I love people. And I think, you know, when we talk about this topic, I come from an orientation of love, but when I say that, I'm loving people that have to experience, you know, these assaults. And so I'll say it that way. And then I want to make a connection to anybody that is willing to grapple with this. So my role in the university is I'm Associate Vice President for Faculty Affairs and Equity Initiatives. And you know, I'm a multidisciplinary sort of a human, if you will. I do a lot of different things in terms of my discourse and what I want to study. But if you want me to talk about, you know, sort of my initial thoughts on the concept of microaggression, I'm happy to do that. But let me just say that I was able to hear, I think it's Dr. Dover, and then also I'm gonna shout out Dr. Scott. I like saying that title now. Sis, you got you got those letters, and that's a big accomplishment. So congratulations again. And so let me just say this. So in my thinking, I come at it like this. It's almost too nice of a concept. It's almost, you know, it's a nice way to say something. Because like Dr. Dover, you just had me thinking, if enduring that, there's nothing micro about that. And there's nothing micro about what it does to the body. This is somatic. So any assault, any discomfort that causes and triggers the central nervous system to begin to go out of whack is not micro. Even if someone can't see it with their own eyes, it's not micro to the person that's experiencing. So I'm challenging in a way, you know, how we even framing this concept. But I get it. I understand sort of the academic, you know, literature on the concept and, you know, about what microaggressions look like. But for me, you know, I'll just initially say that I'm always reminded of W.E.B. Du Bois when he writes in 1903 in The Souls of Black Folk, when he says, you know, rather than asking the outright, you know, question to him, how does it feel to be a problem? Folk will do all these other things, you know, like say things like, oh, it must be exhausting for you to have to sit and listen to, you know, into right? And what they really should be saying is, you know, yeah, how does it feel to be Black and a problem? You know, and so he grapples with that and allows us to see so some insights as to the absurdity of that kind of treatment and how people are, you know, approached when it comes to this concept. So, you know, I'll just, you know, finish my opening initial thought by saying that if we're gonna understand microaggression in any of its forms, we got to start with the assumption that it's assaulting somebody's central nervous system.
I appreciate that, Dr. Berry. And to add to that too, a practical experience example for me would be, quite often I might hear people say in certain arenas that you speak so eloquently, or where are you from? Or as a student, I'll never forget this, as a student, I had the experience that, well, what school did you come from? I'm like, what do you mean? Why does it seem like I had to have come from a unique foreign school to be able to perform well? So some of the things, the ways that this impacts our students, and talking about that mental and physical state that you talked about, Dr. Berry, it perpetuates this mindset that society has on our students of color about not being adequate enough, or when you do perform up to par, then it's this mindset of like, well, how did you get to that place? Why do I need to feel as though I got to a certain place? Why should that not just be your norm when interacting with me as a person of color? Or for me, it could be mental as far as the fact that, well, what do you mean I speak eloquently? Like, or the fact that I might come to class late because I'm dealing with some social economic issues with my family back at home. And so instantly you start talking to me and thinking that I don't want to perform well in your class, or I'm not trying my best. That's another way that the microaggression can affect our students and the way that we perform your classes, because now you're thinking that, oh, I can't do well. So I start picking up some of those same mental ideologies or thoughts behind it. And so I appreciate you saying it, because it does take a mental toll on us. And after a while, that mental toll starts causing us internal stress. And then we start having headaches. Then we start having tension in the body. I mean, so it's not only just mental, but it's also that physical, is what I would add to that too. Anyone want to chime in?
I wanted to just, oh, I'm sorry. Can I add to that? I just wanted to add, in addition to how Dr. Berry so eloquently talked about the damage to the impact on your physical body, because of course you're going to be stressed and carry cortisol, which is going to affect your body. But even on a mentally, there is already imposter syndrome as a human being that is matriculating through college or whatever. And so a lot of times the imposter syndrome, just that impacted, everyone has probably experienced that, but I think people of color, it is kind of an exponential situation, because you are kind of second guessing even if you belong where you are. And so not feeling that sense of belonging is honestly why a lot of people do not continue. And so when we're having conversations about recruiting students of color, recruiting faculty of color, and also retaining them, you have to understand that microaggressions and just the constant feeling of I don't belong, being questioned, or even the opposite end is kind of like that idea of you are a credit to your race, which is not a compliment. It is in fact a microaggression. So even feeling like out of my race, I'm this tokenized person. These are not positive experiences that would contribute to you wanting to stay in a hostile space.
So the one thing to that point, Dr. Scott, and to Kenneth, I mean, you think about the toll, right? What happens in terms of the neurobiology of it. So there are several, studies and scholars who have brought forth the kind of information that's informed what takes place. So, for instance, David Williams, he talks about how racism makes us sick. Racism makes us literally sick. And then, scholars, one of the, again, pioneers in recent memory would be, of course, Dr. Joy DeGroy, post-traumatic slave syndrome. The trauma of racism that starts to inhabit the body. And of course, more recently than that, even Resmaa Menakem, My Grandmother's Hands, talks about racialized trauma and healing. But in all of those scholars' works, what you find is this research around like how the body is shocked through the nervous system and then into the psychological space and then into the biological space where it literally deteriorates our cells. And so, and the thing about aggression of any kind is was what I'm always mindful of is for Black, Brown, Indigenous bodies and people, and even when you intersect gender and all of these dynamics into it, isms are so interlocked that it's not just one thing going on. It's like you're inundated on a daily basis if you live in a skin like such as mine. And so well, that's why I'm saying the term micro is interesting, because it's like, it's not micro when you experience dozens of those incidents every day, right? And so it's additive in ways that triggers that nervous system. And so one of the things you said earlier, Kenneth, made me think about how the psychic space. I call it soul murder. It's soul murder. slowly. In fact, I say that because in Minikim's work, he talks about something, he calls it the soul nerve, which is the vagus nerve, the brainstem, and that when that thing is assaulted every single day, dozens of times a day, it starts to go haywire. Breathing, like you said, headaches, and then your psychological space is inhabited because you're worried about making white people feel comfortable. Our bodies are literally conditioned, and so I think what's instructive, though, is that once we understand the impact, it is really, then it behooves us to understand how to interact in ways with the language we speak. And then what genius, and I say that intentionally, that people who experience these daily assaults, what genius they carry to be able to navigate this world and still make it from day to day. It's an incredible thing. And there's lots of different, discourse about that, but I'm just mindful of that.
Yeah, and that's what I add on as everything all you said. It's like Elvin Murray called it like the survival technologies, right? It's like this comes from like the deep embeddedness of the internalization that we take when these microaggressions become so real, because all of us have like a physiological need of, we need to like have a house, we need to have bills to pay, and there's a game that we have to play to be successful in these like various arenas. And I know one of the questions, I know it's like the last question, but I want to like maybe like bring it up now, is like, what can allies do to like support us, is a question that is often asked. And it's like, I always struggle with this, because it's like the expectations, the things that I would want to say, right, the things that I want to do. So for instance, Chris, I'm the person, I'm placing him on the panel, is like, when I talk to him, we speak in a very different fashion than when other people like might be in the room, because we have a very similar background, we come from a similar place. And it's like, they would call it like dropping the dozens, or dropping into like a lower register, going into like those deep vernaculars. And it's like, no, this is just how I speak on like a normal day-to-day basis. But how our institution has been structured, right? And this is the deep structure. Justin Simard has an excellent article citing slavery, talking about how slavery is embedded deep into essentially every institutional structure that we hold to, including the Supreme Court. And it's like, we have been conditioned that these are the things that are expected of us in these classrooms. And if I started talking in like that vernacular to my students, I'm conditioned to be like, would they accept this as a representation of someone who holds a PhD and is an expert in this topic? Or would they recognize me now as someone who isn't as smart as they think, and they don't need to take what I have to say into consideration? The ramifications are, it's very difficult to separate like who I really am and who I have to be if I want to keep my job.
And it just, as we talk about this, it also just makes me think about how many people of color are experiencing racial battle fatigue and the psychological stress that's imposed upon them from the constant trying to maneuver around whiteness and trying to be accepted in arenas of whiteness, or trying to break through what the mindset is of people of color, or the perpetual, or excuse me, the stereotypes around what people of color should act like or not act like. And so eventually it's you either fight or flight sometimes. So that's why we have some of our students that are just like, you know what, I'm tired of trying to live up to your expectations. I'm trying to figure out who my identity is and grow in my own identity, while also trying to validate who I am in comparison to the student sitting next to me. And it's just very taxing. It's very taxing. And it's something that we have to continuously grow beyond and do our own education and our learning. And so often conversations like this in the Maverick Diversity Institute help, but then how are we also engrossing ourselves in different cultures to learn and understand, so that when we do interact with someone, we're not projecting, we're not asking some of these ignorant questions or naive questions. And my difference between the two, ignorant is where you know better or you've learned about it, but you continually do the same thing. You're naive when you have not been introduced to it at all. But for most of us, it's being ignorant because we have had conversations around it before, but we continuously do things like, well, where are you from? Or can I touch your hair? I mean, I'm sure there's other ways for you to learn about people's cultural backgrounds, their heritage, the greatness that they bring to a society or in a culture, without having to just learn from that one person. I mean, that one person shouldn't be that tokenism for you to engage with, and should be your dictionary, your encyclopedia, and everything else. I mean, there's opportunities for us to learn and grow beyond that. And sometimes the other thing is too, I'll add this, sometimes when we're wanting to learn, we have to understand we can't just dive right into it. I think about the communications theory that I learned as a communications major, which is the peeling back the onion. Sometimes we can't just go right into like, oh, I just want to know this about you. Divulge something about yourself first. Have a conversation that's maybe more surface level. Then get into like maybe some of the more nitty gritty things of what's unique to that particular cultural things. Because sometimes just getting to know the person will allow them to be more open and sharing their experiences with you. So that way that microaggression doesn't feel like a microaggression, but more so just getting to know someone is what I would just add to that. Well, I was going to see if anyone wanted to add anything else. If not, I want to talk about how, as educators, what ways are we working to create spaces for our students as people of color? How does it impact us in the work that we are also trying to do as people of color navigating our own departments or our own areas within higher ed? And what does that look like as far as creating that space, a more inclusive space for all of our students in the classes that we have? Because we work individually with students and we have conversations with them. We're developing them, we're enhancing them, we're helping them understand whiteness and their race and their ethnicity in relation to whiteness. But at the same time, we're teaching them how to not compare to whiteness. But then how are we creating inclusive spaces for other people to learn and grow so these students can feel welcome in the classroom and not experience the forms of microaggressions on a predominantly white institution? And that's the heavy question, so I'll leave it there for a second.
Well, in my courses, so one of the courses that I teach at the undergraduate level is cultural humility. I just love the concept of cultural humility in that it is a commitment to lifelong learning and also self-reflection. And so in that concept, we're understanding that you will never get to a point where you know everything, and you will never get to a point where you do not make mistakes. So not even approaching the topic of microaggressions and racism from a place of, we're going to read this book and then hopefully you'll never do those things again. We all know you will. And so how do you approach it? And so the key to, I think, approaching a lot of these things is understanding what they are. First, understanding what a microaggression is, being very clear, no, it is not okay to say this. No, it is not okay to touch someone's hair. But then also talking about what do we do in those instances when it happened? I didn't mean for it to happen, but it happened. Or as a white student, what do I need to do when someone accuses me of being racist, or someone says that was racist towards me? And so one of the things we talk about is just not being defensive. I think it's incredibly burdensome to be a person of color who has to experience microaggressions, whether we like it or not. And by the way, all microaggressions are not racial. They're also genderized, all those different things. But it is burdensome to have to experience it. And then on top of that, I have to now console someone who is upset, crying, or on defensive, right? And so just talking about fostering this place of, I am going to make mistakes. I need to be open enough to receive others' feedback. And also I need to lean into these conflicts so that I can get at the root cause and go on to a place where I can address and self-reflect and address the biases that I have, because we all have biases. Another thing, just outside of class, I just want to always be a support, especially for my students of color who have experienced a lot of trauma in their educational time that they have. I know I went to an HBCU. I went to Spelman College, the #1 HBCU in the country. And that was a great experience for me because I felt like I was so empowered that I was able to then go to a PWI for my master's program and for my PhD, because I had such a foundation. And I know that my students who are students of color who did not get to go to an institution that fully embraced them culturally, maybe they are going to have even more traumatic experiences that they have to work through. And so I just want to be a supportive for them. And I want them to be able to come to me when these things happen and not feel like if they share something with me, I'm not going to address a faculty member because I'm concerned that I need to be liked by all of my faculty in order to get tenure or in order to do whatever. My concern, my priority is for the students. So, I mean, I also think as faculty, it's not just about having those conversations in your classes, but also holding the line and putting yourself out there for your students so that you can be a safe space and actually take action to support them.
Yeah, that's all amazing stuff, Dr. Scott. One of the things I do is, so I'm a rhetorician by like trade, and so I often feel like whatever thing I have to do to get the message across is useful for me, and so I often don't like bring up things as explicitly as they might be. I talk about difference a lot. I talk about intercultural theory, and intercultural theory are things that I like to use in my classrooms a lot because it can allow people to view things that are actually like very aggressive and very in your face and it gives them enough distance so that they don't feel personally impacted by the thing that we happen to be talking about while still like getting the message across to them, right? I do that with undergraduates, right? With graduate students, for me, I'm just much more aggressive in that it's like I trust that my students are going to understand the conversation we're having. I can be honest, it's like I've only been teaching for a little over like 7 or 8 years. And so I've never had microaggression issues with my students. And I have extremely blunt conversations with them, like talking about like the history of like the N-word, talking about slavery, talking about like systemic racism. And we've been able to have these conversations in the classroom and not have any like blowback. They might reject my position, which is a fine thing because that's something they can do. For me, the issue is much more on the institutional side and the navigations and the politics that go there, where I'm much more worried about the microaggressions. But I often talk about difference. I don't usually talk about the truth or right or wrong, but I'm a rhetorician. And so that's something that that's what we do all of the time. But I like using difference.
For me, I think, you know, if I understand your question, Kenneth, I think part of that was, so how do we help when students come to us, or how do we think about?
It was twofold. It was twofold. So one, how are we helping our students of color? Because we know that we do it individually through the mentorship and things that we do. And then also, how are we creating inclusive spaces by making sure that we educate our majority students in the room?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So it depends on the severity of what's going on in the moment for me. You know, I've had students come in with you know, a sense of urgency when it comes to the triggers that have occurred in a particular moment. And so I think it depends, but I think the overarching thing for me has to do with settling, right? Settling the nervous system, settling in whatever ways that I have gleaned through my own personal practice, as well as a lot of the literature on this. And so what I haven't shared yet, maybe on this call, is that some of you may not, you know, so I'm a, you know, first and foremost, I'm a musician, like, and I think about music as it's the vehicle for me that really drives every sort of my interest in how to see the world and humanity through the arts, and particularly through that medium. And so for me, because that is my way of knowing, I use it not just as a form of performative sort of a process, but it's a way of knowing. It's embedded in sort of how I make connections with other human beings. And there's a lot of different underlying philosophy with that, but and so I try to set up opportunities to see what kind of aspects of that will yield a settling of sorts. And drawing into something that we can all continue to tap into in terms of the very heartbeats that we have. And so in courses, I've led, several either interactions, not only with courses, but some of y'all know if you're in a meeting with me, you might come into the Zoom screen or you might come into the meeting, there's gonna be some music playing. Because and I don't do that just because it's fun and it's I do that because it's a way of just like allowing people that are coming into the space, no matter what you might be dealing with, and to let that nervous system kind of trigger into what's going on with some of those good vibrations, right? When it comes to students, in terms of your question about white students and students who occupy places of privilege, there's some protocols that I think are instructive. The one that I use in my courses is the protocol for courageous conversations about race, because it's based in this concept that's holistic and allowing people to enter into a conversation so that they can, think, believe, feel, and act in ways that gets at settling the body, and also having conversations in ways that allows everyone to experience discomfort with the mindset of knowing what kind of body practice might be to help settle the discomfort in this time. And so, when I teach and I taught my Introduction to Critical Race Theory in Education course, all of these things were employed. All of these things were employed because, there were quote unquote microaggressions even occurring during class when you teach about race. And so to your framing of it, Kenneth, I kind of look at it like this in terms of like whether it's naivety, ignorance. To me, I think sometimes it's a level of exposure. It's in terms of students having a level of exposure to certain ways of knowing and being and seeing that maybe, in some cases, when students are exposed to some things that they haven't been exposed to and they're able to see with their own eyes, that's one level. But then the other thing is acceptance of those levels of exposure, because one of the things that about race that's important is that even though we've been, as people, as Black and brown and business people, have been telling our stories for hundreds of years, there are certain times when no matter what you say, it's never enough to convince certain people. It's never enough. And in certain times, when people are truly interested in making some, understanding in their own journey, then you can tell those differences. And so I think you also have to account, for that type of thing. So in a course, it's about, I don't know if I like the term civility. I know that word's used a lot, but I don't know if I'm just saying, to me, it's about encouraging people to see our common humanity. And that's where, again, this concept, I know, it's a critical race term initially, but this concept of seeing our full humanity, because people carry, particular constructed identities, I'm going to say it that way, that can be overlapping. So I mean, some of y'all might know it as intersectionality, right? But it's the ability to see the common humanity and understand that it might not just be because of somebody's skin color. It might be because of their skin color and gender, or it might be, because in fact, one of the things about so-called microaggressions and people of so-called people of color with, either intellectual or physical disabilities, especially intellectual disabilities, this research says they're less likely to tell you that they have that because they don't want another thing to add to what they're already being discriminated against. So anybody that, is at the forefront of looking at, how we need to be paying attention to people with disabilities, just understand that that is absolutely what we should be doing, but also know that there are plenty of Black and brown people who ain't even telling you they got that because of the stigma of what they already are carrying, and they don't want another thing to be judged against. They don't say it out loud. So, so race, again, right, to me is a central, factor for how we need to be looking at these things. And then all the other ideas, because common humanity requires us to do all of that. So anyway, my discourse in courses and in group settings is to allow through pedagogic and through psychosomatic practices for us to do that. One of the things you can do, by the way, in terms of anybody that's thinking about leading a meeting or starting, a course, is the concept of grounding. Grounding, right? So if you're leading a meeting or if you're interacting in a group setting and you're facilitating, there's ways to do what we call groundings to enter into the space that sets up the conditions for us to see each other's common humanity a little bit better. I can talk more about that, but just as an example for things you can do. If you're interested in that, I can certainly share more about what a grounding is.
Definitely. I think while we go ahead and share more about grounding, and I was going to give some examples the way that I'm doing it over here in student affairs too. Just saying that sometimes it's as simple as just validating and reaffirming my students, especially after they've experienced forms of imposter syndrome or a microaggression in the class, because they're to the point it's just overwhelming. They don't want to deal with it anymore. They don't get to see too many people that look like themselves, reaffirm themselves with people in the classrooms, because we can do a little bit better in diversifying our faculty. So sometimes it's just being able to have the conversation with them and let them know, hey, don't leave us. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about how we can address that. And let's also talk about the ignorance that you experienced from that person. And depending on who it is, and if you're wanting to have that conversation, because that can even be tiring to go back and have the conversation like, this is what you did, this is why you, and how it impacted me. It can be tiring. And I would also say that in the 1 or 2 classes that I have had the privilege of being able to teach, is just talking about culturally relevant teaching and incorporating diverse perspectives. Because another microaggression that some of our students face is having to speak on behalf of a particular identity. That's tiring. Nobody wants to go into a class where they're supposed to be learning and then have the teacher ask them, well, Kenneth, why don't you speak about that? Well, have you experienced that before? I don't want to talk about my experience, first of all. I don't want you to call me out because I am the person of color in the room to talk about my experience. And I don't want to share an experience that's not going to be a uniform experience for everybody because of that, as Dr. Berry mentioned, intersectionality. So not all of us may have had the same experience. And so when I think about creative inclusive spaces for others, sometimes I'll mention something what I say is mirrors, windows, and doors. And as I look at the comment in the chat, it kind of talks about this. Sometimes we are triggered by emotions when we have some of these microaggressions, wanting to be inquisitive or wanting to know more and the intent behind it. But use the mirror and an opportunity to reaffirm yourself and learn about your own culture and what things you need to check within your culture, as well as what things you want to learn more about your culture. So when you interact with others, you're not trying to compare it against someone as whether it's inferior or superior, which also kind of gives some of the intent behind the questions that are being asked. So reaffirm yourself in doing your own learning and validating who you are in that mirror. And then in that window, you've taken the time to learn about yourself, but then you're taking the opportunity to look more out into the world. You're looking at encyclopedias. You're watching documentaries, and also knowing the documentaries and articles and things can also be skewed. So you're comparing them against other information, not just taking one piece of information and taking it as valid for that entire experience. So you're comparing them. You're continuously looking out. It's like looking out and exploring without touching. It's looking out and doing your self-learning that's necessary so that when you do engage, you're not perpetuating microaggression because you want to learn from that person. It's doing the necessary work to educate yourself. So when you engage in the conversation about someone's hair, you can say, oh, I know that that's maybe a sew-in. And I might not know all about sew-ins, but at least I don't need to go ask them, well, how do you change your hair color every day? You've learned a little bit about it beforehand. Or the fact that we have different types of education systems, whether it be a chartered school or public institution, and depending on the cultural, the area, it can give you a different experience as far as your K-12 education. Or the fact that we have people from different countries and their experiences are not monolithic. So do that window of exploring first. And then the door piece is, once you've reaffirmed yourself and done some growing and some learning, you've explored through that window and done some learning and utilizing the resources that are already available out there for you to know more, and doing the education that you need that's necessary, then go out and engage. And quite often what I've seen when I've had this conversation and creating inclusive spaces and having this type of mind, this framework, people's microaggressions are not as high as they were before because it doesn't come from that place of ignorance or being naive. They know a little bit more, so it's not this instant desire to ask that question because it's like, I know about that, or I've heard about it. So I don't have to come to someone and ask them, well, Chicago, aren't they shooting everybody in Chicago? Doesn't every major city have some type of crime? Isn't crime also done by different people of different identities and social incomes? So those are the type of things that happen as a result. So when you go and interact and open the door of opportunity, as I like to say, it provides that opportunity to minimize the aggression that you're causing on other people because of you wanting to learn from them, or you thinking or having a certain stereotype of mindset about them, is all I would say. But grounding, Dr. Baird, I just wanted to share that, but grounding, you want to talk more about that?
Well, sure. No. So you know, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go right ahead.
Yeah, so that's why I say two things. For me, like regarding pedagogical practice, like I often also spend like it takes time. I think as Kenneth said, Dr. Reed said, is like to get people ready for this conversation. And so I normally have the first 2 weeks getting people prepared to have some sort of harsh conversations. And usually it's in my class, like one of my Black students is a Trump supporter, and it took him longer to be comfortable being able to state his opinion in the classroom because he was worried about the potential blowback that might happen because of a position that he held, right? And my duty as the instructor is, how can I get them comfortable in this classroom to be able to share something that is relevant to who they are as a person. And the other thing I wanted to mention is like, and I saw it like going on in the chat as well, is like groundings is that Dr. Baird is going to go over this deeply. Like there is a danger inherent in that. Just because I can just give myself as an example, many of the things that you might have positive views of, I don't have positive views of those things, right? It's like I was raised in an extremely violent environment when I was young, and so many of the things that you might view as happy. So, for instance, I had to take literacy classes, and you do literacy autobiographies, and I had to have a discussion with a teacher that is not a road you want to go down with me regarding how we're going to talk about this in front of the class, or I'm going to talk about it with you, some person who I don't know, like my mother from Adam kind of thing. So, but that is just my one point. And then Dr. Barry, you got to go further.
So, a couple of things. There's no one way to do a grounding. And one of the aspects of it is to consider multiple perspectives. Groundings are not done with any judgment. Groundings are done in a context of recognizing that everybody's being humanized in the space. And groundings are often, in my training and techniques of groundings, there are often ways to get people to do exactly what you just said. So it's like to think critically, to be given the agency to think critically and express their personal perspectives or their even their academic or intellectual curiosity, because this is an academic space. And that's why it's got to be founded upon certain protocols, in my view. In my practice, I use this. That's why I use a protocol. And the protocol I'm using is one that fosters an idea that somebody can be, coming with a worldview that may not be, the dominant worldview in the course, but because they're also human, we scaffold the exercises and we scaffold the experiences so that the free exchange of ideas can occur. And again, that's why I said it's psychosomatic, because the thing that shuts people down, the nervous system gets triggered when any of the discomfort occurs around whether or not I'm going to be accepted in my viewpoint or not. And so sometimes the grounding begins, with what I would assume everybody is doing at the time, which is breathing and just learning into what we're doing already organically, and just taking a few minutes to just sit there and breathe and think. And if we introduce a topic, let's think about this topic. Let's make sure that we align our actual bodies in ways that are going to, be conducive. And again, for me, one of the things that I've learned in this, especially being somebody in the arts, is that sometimes it requires us not to just, be seated. Sometimes it does, because we talk about ability. Sometimes people don't have that choice, but sometimes if you can, it's moving in whatever ways that means. It is getting the body ready and prepared to have these kind of exchanges and of ideas. And so I noticed in the chat, I think there was a statement, we need to be mindful when doing groundings and we have students of color. I don't know exactly what is meant by that. However, I will say this, you notice earlier I said, so-called people of color, because I don't actually use people of color in my own work when I refer to people, because white is a color too. That's part of our problem in my view. I'm saying that, I know the scholarship and a lot of people use that term, but in my view, white is a color too. And I do have some scholarship on that too. But here's the thing, because part of our issue is, so here we're talking about microaggression, we're talking about people of color and all the disproportionate impact of people of color. Well, guess what? White people have a color too. And white people are triggered too. And part of the reasons that microaggressions occur across race like that, from privileged groups to those who are either oppressed or victimized, is because hurt people hurt people. Hurt people hurt people. So white bodies have nervous system issues too, which causes in many cases the kind of aggression and assaults that are inflicted from white bodies onto Black, brown, and indigenous bodies. So what I'm talking about is everybody's humanity. Healing must occur in a sense that we have to humanize this space enough to allow for the possibility of people to see each other in ways that recognizes not only the constructs, all they be, but beyond the constructs, into the self-reflective processes necessary for them to, to maybe think about a different point of view. So one of the last things I'll say on this is, like, you hear the concept, we want to create, we want to have people with open minds. I don't know if that's what I would say. I want a mind that's malleable. I want a mind that has the ability to be valuable in a particular moment. Because if I'm open, I might be open, but I still maintain and hold on to some stuff that may not be actually as humanizing as it could be, as opposed to transformative sort of operational exercises and experiences. So again, groundings are many things, but I think the main idea I guess I'm getting at is it's really setting the conditions for how the space is conducive to seeing each other's common humanity. That's the overarching reason why any of the number of exercises, whether it be you're sitting and you're going to breathe and you're just going to, or just reflect on some kind of a concept at first, to let people think through these things, to not just rush into whatever the topic, if you're at a meeting or a course, give people some chance to get to know each other. Sometimes groundings are doing some activities with students so that they can, interact with each other, asking questions that are really gained at them building relationships with people right in their same course environments and so forth.
Okay, I appreciate that. When we have some of these conversations, the hope and intent is for some of our allies to learn what can they do. We've talked about a number of tangible ways or practical ways, pedagogical ways that can be done. Do you have any suggestions as far as like being active bystanders in the room? Or as faculty members, what resources are available to continue the education or the learning in their field? Or creating the inclusive classrooms? Any other suggestions or ideas? Because again, the intent, I would think, is that we want to create a more inclusive space that's welcoming of all students. So any ideas or suggestions or feedback for that? In addition to what's been mentioned, because again, all the things that have been mentioned before are all ways it can help with that too. So.
But for me, it's like the one thing I would recommend most is like there's an author, Aaron David Gresson the third, and he's written like 3 big books, but all of them focus more on sort of the reconciliation process between the basic dichotomy of how like Americans understand race between like the black and white. But his last book, America's Atonement, right, deals deeply with the phenomenological experience of the white, the wound, and the healing process. And it doesn't feel like it's a book that like was written like from a black perspective, but it's written from a perspective of if we really want to get to that next phase, right, where we're all sort of like working together, right, we're all going in the same direction. This is the kind of work that like really needs to be done. So the reconciliation work, John B. Hatch, as in Mark Lawrence McPhail, are other people working in this reconciliation sphere. These are rhetoricians, so this is why I'm comfortable with them. But additionally, their books, especially Aaron David Gresson third, his books are like very short, very concise, but like extremely dense. And I think that would be a good place to start, especially from like an ally who might not understand the experience. Because again, I going back to like my one student, like the Trump supporter, and I've had that happen multiple times, and it's like that anger, that hurt, is a real anger, and it's a real hurt. And if we don't address that, as Dr. Berry says, right, hurt people are going to hurt people, and it's like we're all in this together. It's like we all want to be successful, I would think, in the end.
I think the idea hurt people, it just shows that a lot of the root to racism and the root of microaggressions and all of these expressions of racism, you know, they can be very internal, they can be deeply rooted at a personal level. And so if you would like to be an ally, I think a lot of personal work has to be done before maybe attending a protest or standing up for someone. I think there has to be a level of internal work that has to be done, maybe just starting with some personal counseling, because you know, hurt does perpetuate. And so if you have trauma that is not dealt with, maybe generational trauma that has been passed on, whether you are white or not, that could be something that could be inciting this continued racism or continued bias. Or maybe you're even noticing when there is a certain issue that is brought up or a value difference that you are very hesitant and resistant. And that could be coming from somewhere, and maybe you personally aren't equipped to know what that is. And that's why we have amazing mental health counselors, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, all of these people to help us work on our trauma. And so that would be my first thing, like really taking the steps to work on towards a healthier mental health. And so you can at an individual level get at some trauma, but then also putting yourself in situations where you are going to be around people who do not think the same as you. I think it's very hard to be an ally if you are never even in positions where you can act on your decision to be an ally. So besides doing personal work, whether that's counseling, also putting yourself in situations where you can befriend people that do not look like you or people who do not think like you. Also doing personal work such as reading books and attending events, amazing plays like Wounded Healers, and all these different things that are going on campus, also in the cities and different surrounding areas, documentaries. I mean, I know Netflix, there's a company that has partnered with Netflix to even, they have learning activities and things that you can do if you want to just watch a documentary that's about race, but you also want to dig a little deeper. Like, there's so many resources out there, but I think you can't wait on a class, wait on a teacher, wait on experiences. You have to be very proactive about that. And then if you do have a class in your department or outside of your department, take that class. Like, if you're not required to take an ethnic studies class, go take one anyway. There are so many amazing courses offered here at MSU and elsewhere where you can just start this learning process, and the learning process is lifelong. So you're not going to take a couple classes and then say, okay, now I'm ready for a life of allyship. And it is lifelong. And a lot of people maybe don't understand what that means, but lifelong in the sense of you will never know everything. And every time you attempt to learn something, you will realize how much you don't know. But use that place of, wow, there's still so much I need to learn and so much I don't know, not to discourage you, but to encourage you to keep learning and keep engaging and keep trying to grow.
I love that. Dr. Dover too. I love how you're both framing your perspectives on this. And so, you know, what I'm familiar with in that whole, that's a complex thing, Kenneth. This ally thing is complex, man. And excuse my language, y'all, but sometimes, you know, you experience these things, I just want to be left the hell alone. I don't need no allies sometimes. Just give me my space so I can do what I need to do. That's tough, right? Because the need to want to, you know, what do I do? How do I, am I biased? If I watch something, if I see something, do I say something? What do I do? That's a hard thing. I'm just being real. I mean, I literally was in a situation just recently where it's hard. Like, what do you do if you're, you know, you have allies? And I appreciate the people in my life who want to be in solidarity with me. No question about it. But it's hard. Yeah, I don't always know myself what do I want you to do? Because I'm just being shocked. I've just been shocked. So here's what I will say about the concept, though, to your point too. So healing and body work, right? And you know, Resma, he says you got to get your reps in, and I like that term. That's just like it applies exercise, and it is this though. It's before you ever hopefully encounter the kind of hot moments in real time, in which then you have to make a quick decision on what you're going to do or how you're going to respond, even in the moment or thereafter. And here's a couple of things. One of the things I learned about wounded healing, there are a number of ways in which you can pursue a lifestyle toward this goal of being in solidarity with any other human being across race and across class, across gender, etc. Do the work in whatever group you are in first. So there's harmonization. I call it harmonization with bodies that are similar. And I mean that like from, again, a standpoint of, you know, identity. And so for me, there are times when I'm with people who are Black and brown, right? Sometimes they call them affinity groups, because I'm looking at how to do that work within the space of what in Africana studies is called the governance structure. Who are we to each other? And how does healing occur? What kind of harmonization and synchronicity do we have with each other? Well, guess what? White folks can do the same thing. Indigenous folks can do the same thing, and so on. And many do, right? But with white folk, what's difficult in the research anyway, that what's suggested is it's hard for white people to grapple with themselves as a group and the history and culture as a group. It's easy to talk about Black and brown people as groups. But for white folk, I've not encountered this in terms of much literature that it's an easy, you know, recognition to think of white people as a group. Because the first thing you might hear if I say, man, white folks stormed the Capitol, they'll say, not all white folks. Not all white folks. You know, and it's like, because it's hard to think of themselves as a group, where Black people be like, yeah, you know, like for me, I'll say I go to Black church. Right? And people that go to that construct, they know what I'm talking about when I say I go to Black church. Like, I'm okay with that as a group, because there's a history of that, there's an understanding, right? But there's also an inherent understanding that Black folks are not monolithic. We know that doesn't mean all Black folk. I know that doesn't mean all Black folk, but I don't need to say that. So that's just one thing I want to get out. But when it comes to this group dynamic in terms of the body work, I would suggest looking at ways of doing that in that vein. So there's times when you can synergize and do some body practices within your own racial group and so forth. You can break that down any ways you want. It could be gender too. And then there are times when you do, you know, so sort of this in an interracial context. And that's where this work about being in solidarity begins. But before you do that, you're doing the work in your own groups in ways that allows you to build up enough in your own nervous system to be able to come together with a little bit more clarity about who you are first, because it has to be self-reflective. So in other words, being an ally is like this. Lilla Watson, the Aboriginal activist, said it best for me. If you have come to help me, then you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with my liberation, then we can work together. And so that's the attitude that I would like to pursue. And that's what I would like to see in terms of this whole idea about, allyship or solidarity or coming together in ways that allows us to understand what it is to act and do when it comes to when we observe, anybody in this other thing. And lastly, I'll say this. This is why it's neurological. I think we have to reanimate what's called cognitive dissonance. We have to reanimate that. Because, and I'm saying reanimate because I do believe that, at some point in human history, there probably was the ability for people to see each other as humans, right? And so in that spirit, what I'm saying is that any human being seeing another human being suffer should not just be standing by and doing nothing. So when George Floyd, I know I'm going to bring that up. So just understand, was being suffocated for nearly 10 minutes. Human beings should not be standing by doing nothing. But because cognitive dissonance has been suspended, it's like the questioning goes, well, what did he do? Well, what? I don't know what, and certain people did do something. I mean, the young woman that took the because there's some safety issues that they do have guns. I mean, I get that, but I'm just saying, so her something was, I got to film it. I got to do something, right? And what I'm saying is that reanimation will cause us to then begin to know intuitively how to do some things and how to act when we're occurring, even if it's not as egregious, even if it's just like we, again, go back to the concept of microaggression, it's maybe speaking in ways that disrupts it, that disrupts the microaggression, or that asks a question, about what just occurred in that moment. So I think it's, sometimes it's intra-racial body practices and experiences and common, sort of understandings and doing personal reflective work. And then it's intra-racial exercises, and that'll be intentional. One technique I'll give you that I learned from, I studied with Resma for 1 year on his work. And so there's a concept he calls triads, where it's accountability. It's also being with people that you build relationship enough to understand and go through your own ability to really understand the depth of your own particular orientation towards healing, and with other people that can help you. And then when you're in larger settings, it becomes a little easier to be who you are, right? To express your voice and to be authentic in your own skin, and that kind of thing.
That's why I had one more thing to what Dr. Barron, Dr. Scott says. It's like Cornel West, he said this best, like you have to dedicate yourself daily back to like the cause. It's like this isn't something that I have to do this every day. This is not something that's I think unique to white people or other people who might not be people of color. If that's the term we want to use, it's every day I have to rededicate myself to the cause, to the thing that I'm working for, to the thing that I'm working towards. And I know if I have to do it, then everyone else also should be doing that exact thing. Herbert Marcuse also talks about the repressive tolerance that has come to plague society. What Dr. Bear was talking about, the downfall of cognitive dissonance is we accept as normal things that are horrific. You can watch the news and the newscaster says something horrific does happen in this plain tone, and we accept that as it should be, and you should be screaming that the person just said that thing and that this thing is going on. And that is a much larger problem though than microaggressions.
Okay. I appreciate that, everyone. And I just add a couple of opportunities to do some continuous learning as well, such as for me, even working in DEI work, I've done more race-related work. So for me, I want to learn more about ableism. And so I attended the Association of Higher Education and Disabilities And that was a wonderful conference that opened my eyes to like universal design, the ways that we support our students in our classrooms, the way we perpetuate microaggressions and macroaggressions. So that's an opportunity for people to write that down as a learning opportunity. And then I think about the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity, which is another one that I go to help sharpen my skills and see what are some of the best practices in supporting students with regards to their identities, both in race and ethnicity. So these are just some opportunities if people want to, look at some continual professional development and exploring. And then you have campus resources such as CETO, the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Dr. Henry Morris, Tim Berry, and other faculty members that are on campus. And again, knowing that while they may be available to have conversations, the microaggression then becomes everyone coming to them to ask them questions about microaggressions and how to support students. That's a microaggression too. So for some, I say for some. So again, just knowing that, there are resources on campus, but also continuously doing your education and learning around that. And as I mentioned before, for me, I have found some great benefit in having conversations with people about mirrors, windows, and doors. Reaffirm yourself, work through your traumas, as Dr. Scott mentioned. Talk about your internal conflict that Dr. Berry has mentioned, the mirrors. Learn who you are. Then go out there and start to learn about others through these windows of opportunity. And then take advantage of those doors and interacting with folks so you can minimize those microaggressions. I would just want to see if there's any other thoughts, lingering thoughts or perspectives or anything, both around microaggressions, race-related microaggressions, ableism, women in microaggressions. I know Roslyn Cobb, a counterpart of mine, and here at DEI, we talk about quite often about how me as a queer person, which I know we're bringing up a brand new topic, but me as a queer person, sometimes there's this conversation, oh, Ken, you want to go to Pride? Ken does not necessarily enjoy going to Pride. I'm a queer person who does not necessarily want to be out and about all the time. Or just because you have a gay friend, I don't want to meet necessarily your other gay friend and think that we're just going to click like that and be in a relationship with each other. I'm still someone that is very complex. And I just leave that there actually, well, very complex. And with working with women, sometimes she and I would talk about how I want to instantly, because of my upbringing, and it's not because it's any ill intent behind it, but just my upbringing of wanting to always carry the bags if Rosalind has some bags in her hands, or saying, hey, let me take that, don't do that. She's like, I'm more than capable of doing it. So being able to balance that and understand this different from person to person with microaggressions. Not everyone is going to see that as a microaggression, as you might assume. So understanding the intent versus the impact for that particular person. And accepting when they told you that something has happened wrong, and it's not settled right with them. And just admitting, okay, well, hey, I didn't intend that, but I impacted them this way. And letting that be okay within your spirit when you're working with somebody else or that particular person too. But beyond that, anyone else want to share any last minute thoughts around microaggressions, macroaggressions, and this aggressive nature that happens as a result of these type of things and how they impact our students? Okay.
If one of the other two doesn't want to say anything, I just want to say, Kenneth, thank you. That was beautiful what you just said. There's a lot of complexity. I just want to I'm honoring that there's a lot of complexity to this, and it leads me to understand, that especially, if we're building solidarity, and something that Dr. Scott said earlier, it's okay if you don't do the right thing and somebody just says, that's actually not how right? Don't take that as that you just don't let it shut you down, because that's a part of building that common humanity. Just understand and keep moving, understand, okay, because the relationship, this is where I get at it. It's about relationships, and the more I do learn about another person, guess what? The deeper our bond can get and becomes and understand. And that's why it's practice, because practice requires repetition. And the more I keep repeating the patterns of being with people and understanding who they are and in their full humanity, the less chance I might do something that actually is not in assumptions I make, less assumptions I make about that person, and so forth. So that was I just wanted to just say that was a beautiful way to frame the concept and the complexity of this. So thank you.
I don't see anyone else.
All right. Can I have one more thing? So I just wanted to add in is like being okay with like failure is like, I think something that people need to become much more comfortable with, especially when you're dealing with topics that are very sensitive as this, right? You are going to make a mistake. It's like something bad is going to happen, but it goes back to what Dr. Reed said, intent and impact, right? And so it said if something is said to me and it's like the intention wasn't wrong, obviously we're still going to have that discussion. But as Dr. Barry says, right, that discussion leads us to have a deeper relationship, right? There is no perfect conversation, right? It's like, and because these topics are so fluid, because every person is unique, right? There are 4 people on this panel, and I imagine that each of us probably has a very different understanding of what might be a micro or macroaggression when it comes to an impact on our lives, right? So the intention is what we're concerned with. We want that dialogue to continue to happen, and then having humility. And this is on both ends, right? It's like, I need to be humble to know that they didn't intend to harm me. And it's like, and now we need to have the conversation so that this might not happen again. And they need to be humble to be like, to accept the critique, to accept the response to the thing that they did, that they didn't know what they were doing, and now that they do. And I think failure and humility need to go hand in hand.
Thank you. I even with glasses, I'm having a hard time seeing that chat. So if anyone wants to acknowledge the message that was sent, I'm sorry.
Sure, I'll read it. Alex said earlier on, Dr. Scott was talking about something that's been sticking with me. For BIPOC staff and faculty, we often take it upon ourselves to protect and develop BIPOC students, either in our departments or advising relationships. But I don't remember that being a task explicitly stated in job responsibilities. We take extra effort and energy not expected of non-BIPOC colleagues, which just further adds to the burnout, energy drain, and everything everyone else already said. And not even touching on compassion fatigue, it's an equity and fairness issue. Absolutely. I think that is an amazing point. I think that a lot of us will say that even if I don't get paid for it, I'm going to do it. That's why I'm here. However, I have to be very intentional about just my own self-care and when I need to slow down and not take on the burden of, or not, I do take on the burden, but maybe not feel like I need to save everyone because I'm one person and I cannot. I think even for me, when I see a need, I'm always talking to my chair because I'm like, I feel like I need to be the person to do it instead of maybe saying, you know, someone else around me could do this. And I think for faculty, it's really important for us to advocate our needs to our leadership. Like being a new professor, I'm just so grateful I have this job. I really don't try to say what I need. And also, I don't know what I need because I've never done this before. But now I'm starting to see, this is a lot. And so even like grading, for instance, when you are teaching about race, grading is like, I don't want to say it's a traumatic experience, but I have had to almost need to do a grounding before I grade because I don't know what I'm going to walk into. And I don't just get on my computer like other professors who get to teach science and math, and they don't have to do that, but I have to do that. I have to do a lot of internal work when I'm grading and trying to, you know, humble myself and teach and be exhausted with comments that are made that are very triggering to me. And so it takes self-care, but also it takes noticing when you feel like you are doing more, advocating for yourself in your department. And I'm trying to learn to do that. And I'm grateful that there are people in my department that are noticing what I'm experiencing, and then sometimes advocating for me when I'm not able to. And I'm so grateful for that. But I just encourage faculty members who are doing that to, number one, take care of yourself, and also to advocate for yourself and saying, hey, this is what it looks like for me to teach this course. This is what I need. This needs to be added to my workload. This needs to be considered when I am getting my teaching evaluations. No one likes this content because it's hard for them. So of course, I'm going to have the evaluations that I have. And I think we have to advocate for ourselves as much as we can.
Okay. I believe this is a necessary conversation that we needed as people of color who experience microaggressions, who also need the support of our community members and our campus constituents and peers. I also think it's very important for us to have had this conversation for our students as we continuously talk about closing the equity gap, creating inclusive classrooms, and creating environments where they can excel and not question their identities through imposter syndrome and because of microaggressions. With that being said, I know that I'm a panelist too, but I just want to say thank you to my peers, Dr. Dani Scott, Dr. Kevin Dova, and Dr. Timothy Berry. I mean, I enjoy sharing space with you all, and hopefully soon we'll be able to do it in person again. Well, not again, just in person. But and again, thank you to the Maverick Diversity Institute for hosting this workshop for us today. We hope that you all have had learned a lot and know that there's still a lot more learning to do. And I'll turn it over to Liz Steinberg Gorley or Sam to close us out.
Thank you all so much for being here. I echo Kenneth's appreciation, and I'm just grateful to be able to share space with all of you. Thank you for your continued support of the Maverick Diversity Institute. We have 3 more sessions this semester, and then that's a wrap for spring. But we do currently, we're looking for suggestions for fall 2022 to continue to offer rich conversations and that self-reflective piece that is so important as we do this work. So thank you all again very much. You can visit our website, which I should have had pulled up, but I will, it's the Diversity Institute at MNSU. You can look us up. But thank you all very much and have a good rest of your day. Thanks, Kenneth.